Good morning, Simon. Thank you so much for joining us for the 6th episode of the Safer, Cleaner Planet series. So just to make a very brief introduction, you are the chairman of Great British Nuclear, which is the body that has been set up to deliver the British programme for nuclear energy across the country. So if you could just briefly introduce yourself and tell us a little bit about how you've come to this role.
Well, good morning, and thank you so much for inviting me to talk. Wow, how did I get here? That's a great question. Well, I retired, and 8 weeks later, ended up in Prime Minister's office talking about new nuclear. But so why me? My background is originally as a nuclear engineer, so I started off in submarines and then left nuclear when I was 30 for the best part of 20 years and did a lot of work in petrochemicals, but all in operations. So I'm an operator by background. Came back into nuclear and was lucky enough to have quite a diverse career in nuclear. So I ran the uranium enrichment business, Urenco, in the UK. I then joined Babcock. I was the chairman of Magnox, chairman of Dounreay, and then moved into looking after the whole Babcock nuclear portfolio, which included submarines. So it's kind of a whole through life experience. Started off in submarines, almost ended up in submarines. But nuclear was something I was deeply passionate about, and having spent so much time in petrochemicals, which I loved, I really wanted to get back into nuclear because I saw that it had a very special place in the energy system and really is just a fabulous technology with great people. So why me? I'm pretty renowned for being outspoken, so I will speak my mind. I'm not one who will hold back. I've got a lot of colleagues and friends in the industry who I've known for a long time, and I'm not associated to any technology or company. So I was one of the people that was independent enough to be considered. So I was invited by the Prime Minister to sprint study together to say, what would it take? And I can talk about what it takes to create new nuclear in a bit.
And can I just ask you, so you were at Cavendish Nuclear before, and also could you just briefly explain the role between yourself and Gwen Parry-Jones and
Sure.
in terms of also what the mandate is for Great British Nuclear, because people need to understand how it sits as distinct from, for example, the Department of Net Zero and Energy Security.
Sure. So, yes, Babcock is, Cavendish is a wholly owned subsidiary of Babcock, and I ran Cavendish to start off with, but then we formed the Babcock Nuclear Division, which also included defence. So that's the kind of where all of that fits together. But of course, Cavendish remains a major player in the industry. And I had a fantastic time working for them. Great company, absolutely great company. What's the mandate? Well, if I can just start a section back to say, what was the sprint phase? What did the sprint phase conclude? Because it's important to kind of look at that first before we talk about the mandate, because the sprint phase concluded having been out to all of the industries worldwide, industry in the UK, but also all of the nuclear systems worldwide, is that because nuclear is such a large-scale infrastructure investment, and particularly at the early stages, is quite a risky investment before timescales and costs get proven, then government has to take a major role. So the conclusion was government has to have a program, and the program word is the most important word we'll talk about this morning. Program means that you've got a predictable set of projects that you can pull on the ground, which means that investors know what they're investing in, and they know that there's long-term opportunity for multiple projects to invest in. And it's also very important for the supply chain. So what's the distinction between the department and us? The Department for Net Zero, they determine policy, but we advise them on policy because obviously we've got a group of nuclear specialists, and we deliver the program. And what's the differentiation between Gwen Parry-Jones and I? Well, we've kind of transitioned a little bit because I started off as an executive chairman, with Gwen being more of a chief executive and chief operating officer. So, but it's now moving much more to a traditional structure where Gwen will be the chief executive and I will be the non-executive chairman.
For an audience that is not familiar with the nuclear industry, can you briefly explain what the 2030 and 2050 goals are that you're fitting into, in terms of the main priority obviously being to decarbonize the grid, create a sustainable grid? And I think, as Gwen Parry-Jones mentioned in the announcement when you were launched in July officially with the nuclear minister, to what extent is this is a significant in terms of being a nuclear renaissance, as the French put it, or a nuclear revival in the UK? How does it represent that?
I think it's a massive nuclear renaissance for the UK because previously we've just gone from project to project. So when Hinkley was announced, Hinkley was a single project. When Sizewell announced, that was a project. And it was never announced in in the overall context of a national imperative. And I would slightly differ from what you said. I think that the national imperative now, it is, of course, decarbonisation, but it's decarbonisation in the context of energy security. So the British Energy Security Strategy is really what prompted the acceleration of nuclear within the UK, because energy security is something we simply won't deliver without nuclear. So
can I just interject
yeah.
there? Could you explain to them what is the current provision of nuclear energy in electricity generation in the UK currently? And what is the gap that you're trying to fill?
On the current trajectory, we will reduce over the next few years because of all the EDF stations, the advanced gas-cooled reactor stations are coming off. We will get down to somewhere around about just over between 7 and 8 gigawatts if Sizewell C and when Sizewell C goes ahead, and when Sizewell B gets a lifetime extension. So with everything that we've got planned currently, we will only get to just shy of 8 gigawatts.
What percentage of that is the overall pie taken up by different energy sources in the UK? So at the moment, how much is the grid and the country generally relying on nuclear, and how far do you want it to get to by 2030, 2050?
Depending on which stations are on, it's between 12 and 17%, but it will reduce back down to below 10% because of the station closures between now and the end of the decade. And the target is to get to circa 25%. And that's represented by a target within policy of up to 24 gigawatts. And the up to 24 gigawatts is really important because for an electricity system, 24 gigawatts may be enough. But in my view, if you take the decarbonisation of the energy system, then it isn't going to be anywhere near enough. So the number could be significantly north of 24 gigawatts. Now, back to your original question, what's the target for 2030? The target for 2030 is to get 2 financial investment decisions by 2030, and that puts us on a path to deliver 24 gigawatts by 2050. So the delta that we're looking at is we've got to get from circa 7 up to around about 24 and above. And that is huge in terms of the number of nuclear plants that are required.
Could you just explain to an audience that perhaps aren't aware what the current capacity is and who are the main stakeholders? Obviously, EDF is a major stakeholder. And also, lastly, on that point, my understanding, and correct me if I'm wrong, the real focus of Great British Nuclear is not so much the large plants, although that, of course, is you're there to support that Sizewell C happening, but rather that actually the focus and what's unique and rather exciting about what you're doing is the focus on small modular reactors. Now, obviously, we're aware that there's also advanced modular reactors, which tend to be slightly different technologies like high-temperature gas-cooled reactors, and then there's the molten salt reactors. But it seems that from my reading, it's really the focus is a small modular reactor. So if you could talk to that.
The current operator is EDF. So EDF operate all of the nuclear stations in the UK. And there are a number of still operating, but those will, and that's what, sits at around about 15% of the current grid. But that will reduce through time. And then Hinkley will come on. And then Sizewell will go. I believe Sizewell will go ahead. We're all very enthusiastic that does happen, but that only takes you so far. So we are reliant on EDF as a partner, and they are a superb partner, and they are very pro-British in terms of what they do. So we're very lucky to have them as the cornerstone of UK nuclear. And the most important thing we've got to do is make Hinkley and Sizewell successful. Now, why are we going for small modular reactors? Well, the harsh reality is the big reactors are, they are very large financial investments. I mean, if you talk in big handful terms, 10 billion a gigawatt is about the right number to talk about for large scale prior to you being able to drive the cost down in time. Now, in our country, that is a huge amount of money, and all of that sits on the government balance sheet. The worldwide nuclear industry has recognized that the way to get the cost of nuclear down is to do it smaller and make it modular. And why is that important? Because once you've proven that you can build them, The modularization means you can do them in factories, so you should be able to build them quicker, and the do learn do loop will be much shorter, so you should be able to get the cost and the timescales down. Now, with the cost and the timescales coming down, obviously the cost of finance comes down. And once they are predictable in their build, and that's probably once you build the first or the second SMR, that's the point at which the private sector, I think, it is an eminently investable entity or project, because the returns will be long-term returns and they'll be predictable. So why SMRs? Because once you've proven them, you should be able to do them faster. They should be lower cost, and it gives you a much lower cost of financing, therefore lower cost to the consumer.
Could you explain to the audience how many reactors there are actually in the UK, because they may not be aware of that, because it's obviously compared with France, it's quite a lot less.
It is about 6 or 8. So of the plants that will remain towards 2030, there'll be 2 plants that will remain towards 2030, which will be Hinkley Point C and Sizewell B, which is a different design, a pressurized water reactor. Those 2 are the main plants that have a long-term life. And then we'll add Sizewell C to it. And that's why I talk about once you've done those things, you get about 7 gigawatts. And that's what gives you this massive challenge to get yourself up to 24. And that's why that gap can be filled by more gigawatt reactors, more SMRs, and more advanced modular reactors. What's our job? Our job is to deliver those projects. We won't probably get involved in Sizewell, but everything else we will deliver.
Can you talk to the procurement challenge? Because you mentioned about the importance to de-risk. To what extent is there a differentiation between defence procurement and what you're going to be doing, which is civil nuclear? Where's the challenge, and not just for the UK, but what you've noticed in the US and how perhaps the French have approached it? And it's quite a broad question, but is the idea to sort of combine those two, or obviously there's a sort of race against time, because obviously in Russia and in China they're advanced as well. Could you just explain the context slightly from more of a geopolitical point of view also, and the regulators in terms of what you're thinking as joint thinking in the West in terms of the challenge and the speed with which you want to go? Because my understanding is from one of the quotes from Gwen Parry-Jones, your CEO, she said that the idea is to deliver this actual projects. You've got phase 1, which is the technology selection of the companies, and if you could talk to that, and then phase 2 being the actual projects, and that those companies going into contracts with the British government. And of course, there's only 1 or 2 that can go to a final investment decision, which would be 2029, with the idea that then it would be delivered onto the grid by mid-2030s. And the idea is that UK, we kind of catch up, if you like, as a global leader potentially, by getting that project done, according to that quote, one of the quickest in the world. Is that true?
So it will be public procurement, yes. So how does it link to defence procurement? The link to defence procurement is not really there. We may follow some of the same processes, but it will not be regarded in that space. The main link to defence is through skills and supply chain. So we work very, very closely with defence because of the skills and supply chain challenges. And there's a lot of work to do there. And if you want, I can cover that a little bit later on. One of the main recommendations from the report was that we have to sort out the regulatory environment within the UK if you want to accelerate. So we have got one of the best nuclear regulators in the world, very well renowned for that. And one of the key things that we've got to do is we've got to get them to work with the international regulators, and they are doing this already, but we've got to accelerate it so that when you do safety assessments, you only do it once. So if you're doing a safety assessment in France or in Canada or in America or anywhere else, you can use the base data of that to be able to inform your safety cases and your regulatory regime within the UK. That doesn't mean you'll change the regulatory regime in the UK, but it does mean you should be able to accelerate. The other advantage, of course, is you can compare and contrast and say, well, why are they prepared to accept this in France, or why are they prepared to accept that? And we're saying that's not safe enough. So there's some real advantages in that. There is a massive piece of work to do on regulation with regard in the UK to do with the environmental regulation, the planning regulations, the grid connections. And as an energy system, we've got to work on. And again, I can talk a little bit about that if you want me to. What therefore have we done with this SMR selection process? The SMR market is a global market. Everybody is trying to do the same thing. New countries are popping up all the time. People are coming back into nuclear because they all recognize the benefit of nuclear as baseload, clean baseload power with a really high energy density, so it doesn't take much space. Everybody's looking at this, from Eastern Europe to Canada to America to the Middle East. Everybody's looking at it. So it is a global market. What we've done is we've gone out from an expression of interest. We've down selected to 6, which the names of the companies are on the government website. And the process that we're in currently is we're just about to launch the invitation to submit an initial tender, which will allow us then to get into really detailed due diligence and get ourselves down from the 6 that we currently have to somewhere between 1 and 4. My clear preference is we end up with 2, so that we end up with 2 fleets. And why do you want 2 fleets? Because you want resilience on the grid in the longer term, so you're not subject to class defects, but also, of course, there's competitive tension to see who gets there first, which I think is very valuable. Now, what are we buying? We are, first of all, targeting the technology vendor so that we are going to offer a contract that co-funds their technology through to final investment decision. So we will work out a mechanism of investing in their core technology to support them through all of the detailed design work and all of the safety and the regulatory assessments to take us to a point where they're ready for their final investment decision. At that point, this procurement also allows us to then do a supply contract. So we'll then talk to them, we'll then contract with them for the supply of their equipment to build the power station. The final part, which is the next part that we'll be doing next year, is we then got to secure sites, which we are really accelerating on now to identify and secure the right sites to build these fleets of SMRs. And we'll have to form development companies, because each of the sites will need a dedicated development company. And these development companies, just to give you some scale, will be the size of a FTSE 100 company. These are very, very big projects. That development company, we will either form as GBN, as a subsidiary of GBN, or we'll JV or put a special purpose vehicle in place to form the development company. And that's the company that will develop the site. It'll own the nuclear license. It will go for all of the consents, and it will buy the equipment from the vendors. So the contract between the vendors and the devcos is how you'll set that up. And they will then morph into construction, and then they will form the generating company. So that's the way in which the whole logic will work. This first part is about detailed engineering, regulatory approvals to financial investment decision, and then the option, as long as they hit the milestones that we need them to procure the equipment into the development company to get it on the ground and built.
Okay, brilliant. Thank you. So to summarize what you're saying, just for somebody who's new to this, you're basically acting like a sort of project developer, if you like. Would that be an analogy?
Yeah, it is. I mean, and the more I've learned about what people call project development companies, it's got multiple definitions. We are the program management company. We run the program for the UK, and we will have development companies that are subsidiaries which run the projects. So we will have oversight over the whole of the programs.
And
but the devcos run the projects.
That brings me to the question about why GBN, in terms of the challenges that have happened across the US, Canada. As I've mentioned in podcasts before, we've done interviews with Romina Velshi, who is the Canadian Nuclear Safety Commission president. And that's where the first of a kind small modular reactor with GE Hitachi is being rolled out. And that is by the end of the decade. That is then being echoed in Oak Ridge in Tennessee. They're sort of going first, if you like. We're following in their footsteps, hopefully catching up. Could you talk to the regulatory hurdle that has to be overcome in terms of building up the expertise with SMRs? There's an entry level of around, it seems, 500 million. I mean, it is a large amount of money that is required to build the capacity. Can you just talk to if that's accurate in terms of the scale of the company that needs to come in order for you to be confident that this can actually be delivered in the mid-2030s? And do you assume that after first of a kind, once you've got to second of a kind, which would be more the UK looking from the Canadian and learning the lessons from Canada and the US, that actually that regulatory burden, once cracked, once that money's been spent and invested in all the training and know-how, actually that will then not, that one won't continue because you've built it. It's like building a company. You've built the know-how. And then and then I'll just talk to some of the companies just to say, so people are aware that the 6 companies that have been selected are GE Hitachi Nuclear, Westinghouse Nuclear, Rolls-Royce SMR, NewScale, and Holtec. Have I covered everybody? And EDF.
And EDF, Neward and EDF. That is everybody. Yeah. Great job. Great job.
So the regulatory burden, and, because obviously the critics, maybe from the environmental side, are still saying this is too expensive. But just on the issue of cost, which is usually one of the biggest criticisms of nuclear, obviously this is the whole point about what you're trying to achieve, is rather than going from a 30 billion type project like at Vogtle in Georgia or Hinkley Point, and perhaps Sizewell C will come in less, I don't know, but small modular reactors approximately, it's said that in Darlington, Ontario, that GE Hitachi BWRX 300, I believe, is going to be in the region of 2 to 5 billion for a first of a kind. And then you've got like X Energy, which is not currently on the selected list, but they are doing a Dow Chemical project in Texas as a joint venture. And that's, again, they're not looking at it being more than 5 billion for the first of the kind. So can you talk to the cost side?
So the first thing to say is first of a kind costs are not understood. Okay, so when people talk about these exact numbers, it is not an accurate engineering estimate because you don't know the unknowns. There are significant numbers of unknowns that you've got to overcome as you go through the first of a kind. And that's why the financing and the funding of the first of a kind is different to the second and the third of a kind. Because when you're building a modular reactor or a new reactor, the reactor technology itself will, there is no question these will work. There is no question the technology will work because it is copper-bottomed, well understood, well-known Gen 3 technology. I'm not talking about things like TerraPower and X Energy because they are Gen 4. I'm talking about the ones that we're talking through. So there's no question they'll work. What is the question? The question is how quickly can you build them and how quickly do you overcome the challenges that you'll undoubtedly come across? There's that wonderful book by Bent Flyberg about how big things get done. Anybody building anything should read that book because, and this is not a plug for his book, it's just got all of the lessons learned about major projects. And our biggest pitfall is everybody thinks they're different and everybody thinks they're going to be far luckier than anybody else. But it is the rigor that you apply to these projects that will make them successful. So never starting construction until you've completed design. Resist the temptation to be forced by the market to make these milestones and put a spade in the ground when you're not ready. Those will be decisions that we'll regret. So there is a real rigor that is required in first of a kind that will de-risk that project. Now, is it helped that people like GE Hitachi, if we end up choosing them, are building in Canada? Well, of course it is. Do we have a really good relationship with OPG? Yes, we've got a great relationship with them because we all learn from each other. The nuclear industry is actually a global family where we all learn from each other. So there's a real emphasis on learning from each other. So that will cover the first of a kind technical risks. But of course, there are first of a kind national risks because it is a different environment with a different regulatory framework, with different labor laws, and all of those things and different skills that are available and different supply chains. So whilst you will learn a huge amount from doing it in Canada, of course you will, there is a lot to learn from what you do in the UK. So I think we've got to just be mindful of the fact that the current estimates, because what I'm worried about people sticking out numbers into the market that everybody believes. And then when those numbers go up, which, in virtually every mega project they do, everybody turns around and says, oh, well, of course, it's just like any other nuclear project. We're far better off being really honest about what we think those costs are and the level of risk that we take in the first of a kind, and then being very bullish about what we do with a second of a kind. Final point I'll make is what makes second of a kind, and it's to your point in one of your points in your question, is at a point where you've got your regulatory design approved, from first of a kind to second of a kind, you're bound to learn some stuff, but you change the absolute minimum. So you've got to basically stop the engineers tinkering with the design unless it's absolutely essential, because the cost will fall off a cliff once you fix the design and you know exactly how to build them and you stick to it. You don't change it. The point at which you change it is the point at which the cost goes up.
So for those who perhaps are not aware of the way large infrastructure projects are financed, you have a model which is called contracts for difference, and the RAB model, regulated asset-based model, which helps to raise capital in a way which can give some sort of guarantees to the financial establishment. Could you talk to the financial models? So it might not be your area, but just a little bit about how on the financing of small modular reactors, you're going to echo the approach that you've used for Hinkley Point and Sizewell C, and also when we'll go on to the second part of the question, which is really looking at the comparison with how renewables have been financed and the big difference there. But I'll go to that question in a second.
All right, fine. And you're absolutely right. This isn't my area, but I'll have a crack anyway. The financing model is not yet agreed with government. Our firm recommendation and the kind of belief around the system, the government system, is that the RAB model really works because it absolutely keeps the financing cost down, because you can charge it to the consumer from the start. So we really believe that the RAB model is the right thing to do. But that's something that we have to agree with the Treasury as we go through to the next stage. Now, having said that, the next stage of what we do in the detailed due diligence will be about the financing models that each of the vendors are prepared to bring to the party, because there are multiple different financing models that each of the vendors have access to or believe they have access to, and we've got to drill into that to really understand obviously whether they're credible and we think they've got legs, and if they do, whether that's something that the UK government can back and support. So I think it's too early to comment on exactly what the financing model would be. Our strong preference would be for it to be RAB, and then we've got to see what the private market can bring in. And we think there are some quite interesting models that we could use that would bring private finance in earlier than we probably believe, because you could say it's quite easy to see how you could bring private finance in on second of a kind at a very affordable level. But we think there may be some models where you can bring it in earlier. But as we develop that, then we'll start talking about them. But too early to talk about them.
And do you think there needs to be a sovereign guarantee for these projects, or not necessarily?
It depends how you or what the scope of that is. The government support package that it will exist for Sizewell, you've got to manage the risk, through construction somehow. Someone has got to bear that risk. What's the lowest cost of doing that? Well, it's going to be a combination between government finance and private finance and private debt and equity. But the balance of all of that has got to be worked through. So the risk in construction, there are a number of companies that are saying they can manage it themselves. Well, we want to really test that, because that is where people have come unstuck in a number of projects globally. And the numbers, when things don't go well, the numbers are very large numbers. Then we've got to work out whether you do or don't need a government support package that acts as a kind of cap or for risk. What we've also got to consider, of course, is operating risk, because outage risk. So when a plant comes down, a nuclear plant comes off and it can't generate electricity, then in nuclear terms, if you get a significant defect, you can be off for a long time. And it's not measured in days, it can be measured in months. So there's also there's a school of thought which says, and it's something that Sizewell will be looking at, which is you need a government support package which gives you outage protection when the plant is off, as well as construction protection. So it's not a simple question. We're not ready to answer it yet, but we know the mechanics that we would use as we get the data and information in from the vendors, and we determine what they're prepared to do and the credibility of what they're putting on the table.
And with regards to decommissioning and waste costs, am I correct in thinking that the way that that model works is actually it's put into the financing at the start? So in other words, it's not something like perhaps with renewables at the end, they have to consider how they're going to manage it. It's built into the whole financial package. Is that correct?
Yeah, and it's also built into the regulatory package. So the whole thing about waste, there's a pile of stuff on, regularly on social media about waste and the scale of waste. The scale of waste is very small, and with the newer plants and the way in which they're built, the level of waste coming out of the plants is far, far smaller than most people would imagine, and that has been in place from the traditional reactors. And as a critical part of the licensing, the vendors will absolutely have to spell out what their decommissioning plans are. And that is quite different to any other industry.
Coming to the slightly more controversial subject of how renewables is getting support from the British government alongside nuclear, I don't know actually what exact figures are in terms of the contribution of renewables to the grid, but there has been talk that there could be blackouts because of the fact that we haven't got our nuclear capacity up in at the degree that would be required for baseload power. There is pressure from the environmental community and the international community to decarbonize the grid. So we've got a situation where the renewable sector can't quite deliver on this decarbonisation agenda. And there is an issue with regards to, I understand, grid connection, whereby even if we get these renewable projects up and running, the solar and wind that are in play at the moment, they're still going to require 10 years before they are connected to the grid. So there is a significant gap. The experts in energy understand this. The British government understands that this is a security of supply and this is around energy crisis as a topic. Obviously, the Ukraine war has exacerbated that. And so the imperative of what GBN has been set out to do is actually very serious. So if you could just talk to why nuclear in terms of how it sits with renewable sector and the imperatives.
Yeah, sure. I mean, the system, this isn't nuclear versus gas versus, well, it is nuclear versus gas, clearly from a decarbonisation point of view, it's exactly that. But it's not versus solar or wind or CCUS or, the broader energy requirements of things like hydrogen and synthetic fuels. They are all a system, and as you know, and they are all absolutely intertwined and they are interconnected. So what does nuclear bring? Well, nuclear brings the steady state baseload power. And one of the criticisms of nuclear is it's not intermittent. Well, no, the newer reactors, the AMRs particularly, claim that they can be intermittent reactors, and there are a number of designs which allow you to flip on and off the grid and keep the nuclear power, keep the plants running at maximum power. So how does all of that fit together? Well, Sizewell are talking about siting a hydrogen plant right by the side of them for the very reason of intermittency. How do you do that? So how do you approach the system? The big missing in the UK is a spatial plan. We do not have an energy system, not an electricity system, an energy system spatial plan, which determines what you want and where you want it and how much you want. And it's a crucial missing. So when I talk about 24 gigawatts, the number's up to 24 gigawatts, and that's actually quite meaningless. What you need is a target that you are going to be driving for nuclear generation. And then you need to map out across the UK what goes where. And of course, there's logic in having industrial clusters. So why wouldn't you have, a grid connection which takes onshore wind, allows you to, site a hydrogen plant right alongside it with some captive demand right next door from something like a refinery, and put a nuclear plant by the side of that? That overall energy system is really attractive. To your point on grid connections, what are the two things that keep me awake at night? One is skills and the ability for us to be able to get the skills that we need. And we're doing a huge amount of work on that. And the second is grid connections and grid capacity. And there's two elements to that. The first thing is exactly as you point to, it does take, somewhere between 10 and 14 years to get a grid connection. And there's a real danger with with some of the renewables that you could end up with stranded assets. And everybody is well aware of that. But there is a substantial amount of work that Nick Windsor, the grid commissioner, has done. And it's very aligned to the work that we've done, which is to accelerate how you accelerate grid connections. And the target is to halve it to somewhere like around about 6 to 7 years. That will be crucial for us. But because of the pace of nuclear and how long it's going to take us to get online, my belief is that problem will be resolved and we'll know how to do grid connections quicker. The piece we've got to get our heads around quickly is how do you fit all of that system together so you put the plants in the right place where the demand is required, and you consider it as an energy system, not an electricity system, because you've got to look at it as that. You can't look at it as just in isolation as just power generation.
Yeah, so that brings me neatly onto sites. But I've never heard before, this is the first time, that there's a criticism of nuclear being not intermittent, just because I'm mindful of Dieter Helm at Oxford University, who wrote a whole book, The Carbon Crunch, I think it was called. And he was basically making the case that renewable energies shortfall is that it is intermittent, therefore it's not providing reliable baseload power. So can you just talk to the intermittency pros and cons of nuclear and renewables, just for those who aren't aware, because it's an unusual way around. And we can just talk about, if you have a map of the United Kingdom, obviously there's sites like Hartlepool on the northeastern coast, then you've got on the northwestern coast, Moorside. Can you just give a little bit of a map to people who aren't aware where the kind of hubs of nuclear development are likely to be, and obviously Wilfer in North Wales?
The intermittency, I think, is a little bit of mischief making, I've got to be honest, from the renewable teams, because and this kind of is historic. The whole energy industry now has matured to a point where everybody recognizes we all need to coexist. So everybody recognizes that battery technology will develop far, far faster than, probably we all imagine, and will become a critical part of it. But there will be times when you're just chucking out loads of offshore wind and that you don't have anywhere to put it. And it does make sense to turn the nuclear plants down because you've run out of capacity. The hydrogen plants are running flat out, whatever you've got, all before the hydrogen plants are commissioned. Then there is a world where when the wind is blowing and the sun is shining, you may not need the nuclear plants running flat out. So that you do need a bit of flexibility to be able to do that. And there's a big debate there for what baseload power is and what scale that needs to be. So the intermittency, it's called system planning and system planning and system operation.
And just to say about what Dieter said is with wind solar, maybe people aren't so aware, but the baseload power is provided by fossil fuels. It's provided predominantly by natural gas. So therefore,
Absolutely.
The point about what you're trying to achieve is to reduce that with over time in an energy secure way. Is that correct?
No, it's absolutely right. It addresses the energy security issue because, why did Prime Minister Johnson start this? Because he didn't want to be reliant on foreign gas. We all know that. So that was the prompt. But of course, then the great benefit is once you get away from the use of foreign gas, of course, you'll need to have gas from a swing perspective or to make up your baseload capacity. But once you've got nuclear there, you're in control from a security perspective of your supply of electricity. So there's a huge benefit to that.
Do you believe that that nuclear is actually the best way to solve both the climate security issue and the energy security issue, and also eventually the affordability issue? Because at the moment we've got renewables to quite a large extent in this country, but our bills are very high and they don't look like they're coming down anytime soon. It's the trilemma, as they call it.
The trilemma, and I love the way they put that. So you'd not be surprised to hear me say 100% yes, because I wouldn't be sitting where I am if I've said no, would I? I mean, and do I believe that? Absolutely, I do. Is it low carbon? Of course, it's low carbon. Is it baseload power and secure power? Absolutely, it's secure because you know what the reliability of nuclear stations are. The reliability of nuclear stations are somewhere between 88 and 94%. They're online all the time. So, that's absolutely a core part of what nuclear brings to the grid. So, but it does come back to this whole system argument. That they have a natural set. You had a second part to the question.
No, I was just saying about, do you envisage a time when once nuclear has actually been built or small modular reactors have been built, the costs for the public, this is not so much from the investor point of view and returns on investment, but from the public interest perspective in terms of affordability to power our industrial base as the United Kingdom. This is, for me, a core issue from the public interest point of view. We want to have affordable energy to be able to power our economy. Is that something that you think can be achieved?
Oh, yeah, no doubt. So the numbers we've done, and we've independently verified them, is that if Hinkley Point C had been online last year, it would have saved the consumers 4.2 billion. Very simple. At the existing strike price. People talk about the £92 strike price as being, it's outrageous. With the current energy prices, nuclear saves a huge amount of money for the consumers. And people get fixated on the capital cost. You can't think about, these are long-term investments. These are plants that can run between 60 and 80 years. And the capital cost is amortized over that time. And when you look at the unit cost on a through life basis, it is, as competitive, if not more competitive than renewables. So you have to think about it in that context. And it's really important people remember that number, because it would have saved 4.2 billion for the consumer. So there is no question that it gives you the answer to all parts of the trilemma, particularly cost.
And so going to the phase two, as I mentioned, phase one was the selection of the tech vendors that you're looking at in detail. And then phase two is about the actual projects. So if you could talk about the sites that are currently being looked at, and how the ones that don't necessarily get to financial investment decision, that you would be supporting them in other ways.
What we're looking at to start off with, why have we chosen the vendors we have, and that will inform the sites that we need, is all of this is about scale and pace. Energy security is the former. So priority one is energy security. Priority 1.1 is decarbonisation, but it is energy security first. So we have to go for scale and we have to go for pace. So we're going to be looking for sites that we can build multiple reactors on. So all the infrastructure is done once, and therefore you get the cost down. The sites that exist within the policy statement at the moment are places like Wilver, Albury, so Wilver in North Wales, Albury just outside Bristol, Heysham on the east coast, northeast coast, Hartlepool on the west coast, and then you've got sites like Bradwell, which is currently being looked at being developed by the Chinese, which is down in the southeast. So the way I look at it, and it's just the way I look at it, is I divide the country broadly into five, not including Scotland, because Scotland is not currently in favour of nuclear power. So for the northwest, which includes Moorside, as we talked about, Moorside is just outside Sellafield. Moorside through to North Wales, that's a natural area that you'll be putting reactors, no question in my mind. Southwest, you've got all the capability that sits with Hinkley, but you've also got Albury. So Albury is a very good development site. Southeast, you've got Bradwell, which again is an attractive site. Which currently was in the existing policy statement, and then Hartlepool in the northeast. The middle is where you could build the factories, and it may be that you don't build them, but you could see, and from a skills perspective, we divide it up into five and say, okay, what would you do where? Now, this is for phase one, for wave one. We will need every site we can possibly get to be able to deliver up to 24 gigawatts. And so the sites that are in the current policy statement are just for the start. The really important part for us to think about, and this does require a major change, is that the AMRs, the advanced modular reactors, will require a different regulatory regime, because they are inherently lower risk, because they need a much smaller zone around them. Because if you take what X Energy would claim that they are passively safe, they're walkaway safe, and they don't use walkaway safe anymore. But I think it's it's a good way of talking about it, because it means it doesn't matter what you do with it, you can walk away and it's safe. At a point where you get that as an approved method of operating, and everybody recognizes that the risks are minuscule, and therefore you can walk away from the plant, you can stick them anywhere. So you don't have to worry about nuclear plants. You've got the public debate to win. but you can put them anywhere. You could put one in Grangemouth, for example, as a refinery, or Fawley, or next to a major data center. What you then do is you open up both for decarbonisation. The benefits are huge, but you open up so many different sites. And of course, you start dealing with the grid problem because you can do a lot of this stuff off grid. So AMRs are a critical part of what we need to do next. And they will require a different regulatory regime, but that gives us access to a much broader set of sites.
And those are called high temperature gas core reactors generally, or it's molten.
Yeah.
Well,
yeah, there's a range of them. They tend to be much higher temperature, and therefore they tend to be able to be used for
steel.
Both. It's any form of manufacturing that requires heat.
Yes, because there is a project in Japan, I believe,
and China, yeah,
which has been going quite safely for a while. So if we can just talk about the skills and supply chain security aspect. So from my point of view, I know that nuclear is actually providing the highest wages, the highest paid jobs in the energy sector, the longest employment security by far. So for the new generation coming to through universities, through training programs, could you just talk to how you're joining the dots with what the projects will be, the vision for Great British Nuclear, and really about inspiring the next generation as well, in terms of where we've been in the past and how you want to go forward, especially with the universities and whatever institutions are coming together to help make this happen.
Yeah, sure. So we've got a nuclear skills task force that is looking at all of this, and we've got a fabulous group of people running an organisation called Destination Nuclear, and it's to exactly your point is how do you make nuclear more accessible? So if you look at a number of the armed forces adverts on, I think there's the Navy's adverts talks about born in Sheffield, made in the Royal Navy. That sort of style of advert is exactly what we're looking at for the industry to access both mid-career people and more graduates into the industry. We need to up our rate of recruitment from around about 7,000 a year to probably 20,000 a year between defence and civil. So the attraction and retention is hugely important. Destination Nuclear is going to be the campaign that we're going to run and the kind of website that we'll be forming to allow people to come in and get a window on the nuclear industry, and that will make the industry much, much more collaborative. So it is something we're finely tuned and focused on, but we recognise we've got an awful lot of work to do.
Where are the hubs for the university programs and sort of jobs, generally speaking?
Obviously, there are Manchester University, the Dalton Institute is renowned. Imperial is very good. But we're now broadening out because those are the traditional hubs for. There's a lot of we need a huge number of PhDs between ourselves and Fusion program, which we work very closely with. We also need a huge number of PhDs. So there are multiple universities around the UK, including places like Strathclyde, that have real nuclear expertise. We're broadening out now to look at taking the work to where the workforce might be, as opposed to them having to move to where the nuclear hubs are. So, for example, Rolls-Royce Submarines have set up a hub in Cardiff, or they're doing it in Cardiff, in Glasgow, in Dounreay in the north of Scotland, because they recognise that they don't need to have the people close to Derby. They can have them where they actually exist. So we're looking at across the UK. So it would be a fallacy on our part to say that we're just going to focus in one area or another, because that's not going to give us the answer we need.
So just on the point of acceptability, you mentioned that just earlier on. Obviously in the 70s, there was a movement, CND movement in the UK, and I think a lot of people, Oliver Stone did a documentary called Nuclear Now. There's a lot of films and documentaries being made around this subject and trying to, in a way, address the myths around the difference between nuclear weapons and civil nuclear. My understanding is that the British the British people, are quite in favour of nuclear power, and that there isn't as much resistance as one might imagine. What's your understanding of the acceptability at a national level, if there's any polling that's been done, and also at the sites, for the sites? Because my understanding where the sites are, they're actually very, very keen to have these jobs and that job security. So it's not a simple case of it being there being a big anti-nuclear movement, I understand.
No, I think that's accurate. And again, I've got to be careful here because I would say this, wouldn't I? But in all of the sites, so let me start off on the site basis. In all of the sites, within the travel to work area of every nuclear site I've ever been, they are incredibly pro-nuclear because of the quality of the jobs and the longevity of the jobs. It is a community based around a nuclear power station, and therefore the acceptability locally is really, really good. And therefore, of course, you'd want to build. You want to build locally, so you want to build in the existing nuclear sites. Nationally, Julia Pike from Sizewell C talks. She's better to talk to this because I can't remember. This might not be correct, but I think the national acceptability of nuclear has risen to something like 65 to 70% now, purely because it's recognised as being part of the journey to net zero, and that without nuclear you cannot address the energy security issue. So the nuclear weapon side of things, I think, is considered quite separate, and rightly so. Nuclear power, and although you've got nuclear-powered submarines, the way you design them and build them is not dissimilar to the way you buy civil. So you can put all of that lot together and say, do you understand nuclear power and what it gives you? Yes, you do. Well, so it gets very, very high degrees of acceptance because of its strategic national importance, I think.
With regards to phase 2 and selecting the companies that you are confident can deliver for the 2030s, to what extent do you believe there's a non-partisan, or rather a bipartisan support on both sides of the political equation? Because looking at the institution of Nuclear Industry Association, it appears that there's broad support. So are you confident about that? If there's a change?
Yes, we are. And how do I evidence that? Well, we have a nuclear week in Parliament, and at the kind of the parliamentary reception, Andrew Bowie, who is the nuclear minister, and Ed Miliband shared a stage, and the only thing they disagreed on was the importance of gigawatt. So Andrew quite rightly, said we're really focused on SMRs to start off with, and Ed Miliband stood up and said, so are we. We think this is, really strong. And the reality is the cabinet, the Labour cabinet and the Labour Party appears to be as supportive as the Conservatives. So the national imperative is so clear. There is nothing that we've seen would indicate that the direction of travel or the pace will change.
Okay, but that's wonderful. I think we've covered everything, Simon. I really enjoyed that conversation. Thank you so much. So best of luck with phase 2.
Thank you.
And hopefully maybe we can have another interview after the next Parliament and you're further down the line with everything being
fantastic.
So well done for everything you're doing, and thank you so much for your time. I really appreciate it.
Thank
have
you for
a good run up to Christmas. Okay.
I will.
Goodbye.
Thanks.
Thank
Take
you,
care.
Simon.
Bye-bye.
Goodbye.